Moving on to the next panel. Christina, if you want to join me back again, and anybody else who's on the next one. And let's see where we're at here. So the next one's the great stake, how exchanges are quietly becoming the banking industry's biggest competitor. This is being moderated by our friends over at CoinRoutes and Mr. David Weisberger, very knowledgeable person in this space, and you're going to see why in a second. And Adele Elmasiri, happy to have you both here. So with that said, I'm not sure who is going to be able to make it. I know we had a few people that had some conflicts, so why don't you guys get it kicked off, and then people might add as time goes on. David, you're on mute. Both of you guys, actually.
Hey.
There we go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
There you go. Yep.
Okay, great. So thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, the topic that is interesting, and our perspective for those who don't know what CoinRoutes does, is we provide access technology for people to trade utilizing crypto exchanges and market makers as well, algorithmically, which is much more like what you see in traditional asset classes. But as a result of that, our clients directly of the exchanges, we do a lot of business with the exchanges and understand their parts of the business and have kind of a perspective in terms of the way the market is evolving. I don't know that it's so much in terms of replacing, banks do a lot of things. Certainly in the world of crypto, firms such as Coinbase buying Tagomi, to try to become a prime broker, that is a very banking function. So where people, for those who don't understand what that means, prime brokers' primary function are to provide investment managers the ability to finance positions, to borrow, to create long versus short positions, to simplify and streamline operations for their trading, and also to provide market access. That's generally the things that prime brokers do. They also may introduce managers to pools of money, so-called cap intro, etc. But those are the things that are prime brokerage, and that is a very banking-oriented solution. Coinbase has clearly made it clearly identified the fact that they are going directly after that. So that's one way. There are others, but rather than me talk about that, why don't, Adele, why don't you talk a little bit about your perspective on this topic, and then we can see where we take it from there. And also, I'm the CEO of CoinRoutes. That's from an introductory perspective is fine. You can go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, hi, my name is Adele Elmasiri. I have a PhD in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and I was working in a field called trust networks and published my last paper in 2010 when it was a stagnant kind of field, like we basically researched all topics, and then blockchain happened, and all of a sudden it's the whole new craze, and I found myself publishing a lot in blockchain. I'm very active academically, as well as I'm an applied science. I like to actually practice what I preach. So I do everything from trying mining and building tokens, understanding how tokenomics works, how the exchanges works, and how the entire system functions, because you have to try it for yourself in order to really appreciate how it actually functions there. Beside blockchain, I usually publish in artificial intelligence, supply chains, and have talks almost every other week around those. Last year, I was like in 52 cities. This year, I am in Zoom land all the time.
Zoom land all the time. So, I guess, from Christine or Jeremy's perspective, I mean, the thing that's interesting is people often talk about, two things when you bring up crypto versus banks. One is DeFi and decentralized finance, disintermediating the banking system. And the other, far more basic, is about nature of money. Whether, and people talked about terms like store of value, or we're hearing in terms of transactions. Just before we were talking about whether you could buy a cup of coffee, with Bitcoin, etc. Why don't we start with distributed finance? Because I admit to not knowing nearly as much about that as I understand about the monetary side. But do you have any thoughts in terms of how this sort of distributed model what does it mean for, the financial, basically what the basic function of banking intermediation going forward. And then we can see if there's something else there.
So that's actually a really good question. And since it's the two of us, so I'm going to elaborate a little bit on it. So in order for us to understand and appreciate what's going on today, we have just to go back a little bit into understanding the history of finance and money itself and how it all began. So way back, it was bartering. I give you a chicken, you give me some eggs. Then moved into some form of precious metal that everybody started to agree on, gold and silver. But then it also moved from nuggets into an actual, some sort of government or tribe minted pieces that carry more authenticity, that this is actually authentic, it's not like fool's gold. And then from there, it became really hard to carry all those bags of gold when you are trying to go from one city to the other. And banking start to exist as just those places where you deposit your money and for a safekeep and you get it out from them. So they started giving you a banknote. A banknote is basically a promissory note to say, you've deposited, 5,000 pieces of gold with us. And if you go to our branch in Amsterdam, you're gonna get those 5,000 pieces of gold from there. And the word in French for money is actually banknote. So that's where it all started. And then back in the 70s, when Nixon removed the gold backing from the actual note, so it became simply a promissory note that says, we will give you whatever is the buying power of this note so that you can use it to buy things with it, which is a really salient point, because we hear a lot about like the intrinsic value and and people, especially in the fiat world, they will say like, what is the really intrinsic value of Bitcoin or any of those cryptocurrencies? And that was kind of like some sort of argument until the pandemic came, and we've seen the values of companies plummet down from 150 to like $5 and then swing all the way back. And the stock market became more irrational than the actual crypto market, which then established the point that it's not the intrinsic value, it's the perceived value. So that's what gets us to this point. People at this age are perceiving the value of something. That's what gives it its value there. So that's one point. The other part of it is that when the world was smaller and less interconnected, the systems that existed were adequate. So bartering in one village, gold and silver when you had like a group of smaller cities, and then the banknotes when you had like major cities and countries to go through. But then we moved into plastic. Right now we have moved into a more interconnected global world that the current economical system cannot handle all of those. It cannot do all the transactions fast enough, and cannot reconcile all of those with the finality on it. So from a financial point of view, we've seen a lot of banks work with Ripples and other networks to try to create the settlement system, because the fact is current systems cannot really handle how fast and how complicated the new world is becoming.
So there's a lot of points in there that are worth unpacking.
David, before you get underway, I just want to announce I invited Gary from Coin Market Manager, which, by the way, was just the winner of our pitch competition. Very well versed in all the things like token related as well as exchanges in terms of providing metrics for that. So I wanted to get him integrated in the conversation as well.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I was just going to say what's interesting is I talked about this. I talk about this a lot actually. Is the notion that you brought up a few of them. I mean, in addition to, it didn't go straight from barter to gold or silver. There was actually a short period of about 1,000 to 2,000 years where people used seashells, kind of in there. And I often point that out, not because I'm anal retentive, although I am, and not because, as my wife says, I have to correct everybody, because I don't have to correct people. But I think it's really important, because what is the intrinsic value of a seashell? I am literally sitting about 200 feet from the dunes and a couple hundred yards from the beach or from the ocean. So I could walk out and get seashells. I mean, they've been pounded by the surf, but the fact is they're there. That was considered a value for a while. And, people talk about the properties of money, but at the end of the day, the reason gold is valuable or silver is valuable is, and yeah, they look pretty. And I guess I have to hold it over here, the way the camera works. It happens to be a silver coin. The fact is, it becomes something that people form their trust in. It's not because of their utility in jewelry or electronics. It's because people trust. So that point you made is exceedingly important. What's really important is that people of our age, certainly my age, most of them, many of them a few years ago when I went to Found Coinroutes thought I was an idiot. They said, how could you leave traditional finance to deal with this stuff? What's the value? And, what's interesting about it is if you talk to anyone who's 30 or under and try to find someone who has not seen value in something digital, who has not played a game and paid for something in the game, in real dollars to get something of value in the game, whether it's World of Warcraft or, more modern things, Fortnite, etc., there's value. And there's an entire generation of people who understand that digital things can have value. So this notion that it can't have value is just nuts. But, what does get talked about a lot is, well, it moves around in price so much. And, if you watch videos, explainer videos about Bitcoin, it always happens. But people miss that point too. The fact is Bitcoin right now is still very early in its evolution. The fact is that anything to become a store of value, you would need to be at a market cap that looks something like where gold is. That would imply a Bitcoin price of, 40 to 50 times where we are today. On its route to getting there, if it is going to get there, it will be volatile. Once it gets to that price, we'll see what the volatility is. It could very well be less than a lot of major foreign currencies. And so it's really an interesting question. So I don't think volatility matters. But before I go off on a tangent, Gary, you heard what Adele was talking about and what we are, from comparing the financial system that we currently have with banks and intermediation to where crypto is. I'm curious, what's your perspective?
Well, I think at the moment you brought up a good point just then, which was that there is a lot of volatility, and in order for mass people to adopt it, they're essentially going to be gambling at an early stage, or just taking money that a lot of people don't seem to have at the moment, and just putting that aside, hoping that there's a nest egg to be sort of one at the end of the day. And I think where we're at the moment with stable coins, that's the best way for people to do some transactions based on the local currency. I mean, I think that if we're in a situation right now where I want to have a store of value and I want to go and buy something, the fluctuation is going to be too problematic. But what I see when I look at companies like Binance and who are dominating the market, I see a situation where when we look at the market cap of 180 billion or something like that, it's such a small amount of money that when the banks finally decide to come in, I still think that the banks will own this industry and not the exchanges themselves. They'll have their own banks, have their own exchanges and take control of this situation. At the moment, it's so child's play, I would say. I'm not sure if you agree on that.
I think he's having some network issues.
Yeah, there is an interesting point right there. I actually would take the other side of that. I don't think the banks will get there. The banks never got there in the exchange space in traditional markets. Having spent 14 years from Salomon Brothers ultimately into Citigroup, I don't believe the banks move quickly enough or innovative enough to deal with a new disintermediating force very well. Maybe they will. But, if anyone's ever read The Innovator's Dilemma from Clayton Christensen, which is the best first chapter of any book I've ever read, the rest of it kind of repeats the first chapter. But, the point that it's hard for disruptors to the reason that disruption happens is because your clients keep you doing what you were doing until it's basically too late. I would be very surprised if the banks got in there, but I would not be remotely surprised if the large exchange groups that dominate in traditional assets and the large firms didn't stake their place. I think that is a very interesting point, and I think it definitely is worth thinking about. But
do you see them being consumed by? Do you see someone like JP Morgan or some other big banking industries coming in and just consuming those exchanges. So they'll let them play around in this area at the moment until it becomes worthwhile enough for them to go, okay, thanks for all the hard work. We'll just buy you out now and take control of this industry.
It's possible, but you know, right now their incentive would be too strong. I have a very interesting perspective on this because I spent my entire career between Morgan Stanley and then what became Citigroup. I started in program trading before I moved to Stat Arb and you know, quantitative trading. And I can't tell you how many meetings, but the number is over 1,000 that I had where the word cannibalization got used. And so we were a lower margin business that started up within a bank, and I had to defend our existence for the better part of 20 years against people who saying, well, you're going to hurt margins. The reality was that ultimately a lot of that business left. There's a reason why retail trading against retail flow, which was owned by the big banks and the big brokers, ended up leaving. Not one of them are involved. Now you have Knight, KCG, which is part of now Virtu, Citadel, GTX, and firms like that do all the market making. The banks are no longer in that business because they literally could never get their minds around cannibalizing their own margins. And by the time they saw what had happened, it was too late. So it's possible they'll learn. But I'll give you an example about Chase, Citigroup, and JP Morgan. Let's just talk about one simple use case from crypto, the ADR, the American Depository Receipt. So think about, and that is billions of dollars that are made, okay? Now think about what that is. That is, US investors want to buy shares of a foreign company, and they have no ability to buy it on the foreign market without going through lots of different twists and turns or paying a lot. So enterprising banks got together and said, you know what we'll do? We'll own these shares and we'll then list shares on US exchanges. For a very low fee, which is worth billions to them, we will create these shares and list them and do all of the work so that people, US-based citizens, can buy them. There's sponsored ADRs and non-sponsored ADRs, et cetera, but it's a very, very large business. Now let's look at what happens if foreign companies can tokenize their equity. Now, all of a sudden, every exchange that can trade a token will allow US customers, assuming the SEC ever allows US customers to trade any of these things, can all of a sudden buy this for an infinitesimal fraction of the cost of what would happen in an ADR program. In fact, the ADR is probably a bad example. The better example is American companies being sold to people outside of the US where the SEC can't stop it. Just that level of disintermediation is a big deal. And that's why when I talked about cannibalization, you start thinking about the number of very profitable businesses that banks are in that could be disintermediated via tokenization and crypto. And you immediately start understanding why it is that I've made two statements in the past. Number one, in 25 years or so, everything will trade digitally. And number two, I said 25 years for a reason, because the banks are going to fight like hell, using every tool at their disposal, which includes influencing regulators, to keep this from happening. It will take time. And it's no different than what happened with electronic trading, which was technologically capable of handling all trading in basically the early 90s, but it literally took until last decade before every exchange was trading electronically. So these things take a long time when there's this much money at stake.
What do you think happens then because I feel like so much of our industry and the world that we live in is still heavily surrounded by corruptive money moving around. And I feel like the system will want to fight to stay in place. And in order for that to happen, the infrastructure of just fiat currency moving around is so entertaining to that. And the blockchain itself is kind of difficult right now for you to get away with a lot of these things. So some of these things I feel will stay in place. Otherwise, we're in a great situation if it doesn't.
Well, the only answer I will have to that, and I'd love to hear what Adele says. My only comment is things work until they break. And it's going to take some events that are going to happen in order to break people's power. That's generally the way it works. But at the end of the day, you're right. Adele, did you have something to say on that one? I'm sorry as I cut you off, I think.
Yeah, so you guys remember Jurassic Park, right? Remember when they got like some water, put it on his hand, and said like water will find a way. So the problem here is not whether the banks will allow it or will not allow it, or governments will allow it or not allow it. The problem is that there is no other good solution to do that, and we will have big issues coming through in spite of all of the systems in place. A big example of that from the banking industry itself. Back in the 90s, when I used to purchase shares, I would pick up my phone, call the broker, and pay $24.99 just to place an order and have to chat with him for like 5 minutes to do that. Today it's free. They can do it on my computer. I might even pay like 2 cents for the sec, but that's it. And even a major kind of like trading desks offer fractional shares. Unbelievable. You would not even thought you could buy a fraction of a share, but you can today legally in the States. So, and people argued against that, hey, you need an advice of a seasoned broker to tell you how smart or stupid you are. And you need people on the levers to can pull the levers on and prevent a frenzy or a catastrophe. But all of that went out of the window when nobody started using those, and people shifted and started to use this. So this is what we are faced with. And things will change in spite of us for a couple of other reasons, pandemic being one. So all of this money being pushed to people through checks and all stuff, this is a fiasco. Imagine if we could do airdrop to everybody, it would have been much easier. Another thing here, we keep talking about unbanked in the world and kind of like, Africa and all that stuff. But according to the Federal Reserve in the United States in 2018, there is 55 million unbanked or underbanked adult Americans in here. That's roughly 22% of the whole households of the US. And furthermore, in 96, there was a federal law that was passed that contained the provision requiring the federal government to make electronic payments by 99. So there was a big issue there. How can you, as a government, mandate that you would have to do electronic transactions with people when 1/3 of your population do not have any kind of banking that you could do that with? So there was a whole solution to get a debit card, all of the stuff. So that, what I'm thinking is that the forces behind this economy growing and connecting people together is forcing that. Another analogy that I will summarize this with is the Berlin Wall kind of like fell down, not because of a military might that came and destroyed it. It's because of the people. The people forced this entire regime to fall down and dismantle itself. So this is what's happening. Bank systems today are incapable with the current infrastructure to service the needs of the users, to basically be able of using digitized assets that are programmable, that can shift very fast, very quickly, faster than they can think of it. So we need to create new systems there, and you are seeing the cracks in the system right now, which we'll talk about next.
So I mean, I have to admit, I love listening to people from outside the industry describe basically my life story, which is automating and that. I mean, I ran Two Sigma Securities, which is a market maker that was one of the places that is the reason why it's free to trade, because we traded with all the brokers that were free and bringing those margins down. The only point that I'll say is, while I completely agree with you, it took a lot longer than the technologists thought it was going to take. It happened, and it will happen. That's why I'm very certain, but that the timing takes a long time. But there's a lot of other stuff. I'm sorry, Jeremy, you were going to say something else?
No, totally fine. No, so one point I really want to bring up, because I'm really curious as to all you guys' opinions about this. We called this the Great Stake because also, wanted to talk about staking, right? And we're seeing what's happening in the space. You're looking at the interest rate environment globally. In the US, we're at 0%, just depending, on the type of length of the term. And you look at globally, we're at negative interest rates in certain places. So for the average person looking at that, and they're coming into crypto, they're getting more educated and realizing, okay, if I go to Wells Fargo and I put my money in the bank, I'm making $0, as opposed to, there's a number of different staking companies that are doing well. Tezos, Neo, VeChain, Pivx as an example. I myself have, bought some Tezos, and I've put that on Coinbase, and it's just earning, I think it's like 4.36%, which is arguably a heck of a lot better than zero. So that's where I see some massive disruption. unless they utilize the same type of infrastructure and technology and give this same benefit to people on traditional kind of banking platforms. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
I don't know, we did not hear from Gary. So Gary, you want to take it first?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many interesting ways to look at this. I think one of the things for me is looking at how easily micropayments can move around on systems like what we're currently, like the current blockchain system, like the coins that we have out there. It's going to change the way that people are able to push money around to other people and potentially lending, in terms of finding different ways for you to have this this pool of money and move that around to other people in order to get a return. At the moment, in order to push that money around, the fees are involved. There's a certain level of trust. So many of these things can be captured by having your wallets like this and easily moving money around. I think that's one aspect of this that's that should be taken into account. Yeah, I need to have a think for a moment, and I'll leave it to David for a second to.
Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects of what you talked about, Jeremy, and they're both important. One is staking pure and simple, which are proof of stake chains, where the mining rewards, and it basically what you're effectively saying is we believe this network has a use case and it will grow, and as the network grows, the holders and the early holders of the network will gain interest in that. It basically means staking in that essence is essentially not very different than buying some physical, I hate to use the word security because the lawyers all of a sudden descend like vultures, but the fact is that you're buying an asset where you're being paid because of the fact is that staking node is doing the mining, is providing the verification services, etc. And so you're essentially like owning the railroads in Monopoly, right? And so you're getting paid the utility for people using it. That is a really interesting business model that the technology allows for and can potentially help grow many things. It's not really, the analog is more to dividends than it is to banking, but you're right, it's an interest rate, it's a payment, and it's a financing mechanism. And so to that degree, it's interesting. I think the technology has enormous potential to do things that are good. So that's one. But the other, which is much closer analog to it, is what's happening in the lending markets. Now, you've probably heard about Celsius and Genesis and other large lenders, BlockFi, et cetera, who give you very high interest rates for Bitcoin and potentially other coins as well. Now, the reason that works is because those coins are so volatile and there's so much arbitrage going on. There's so many reasons that people need to be able to sell or take ownership of coins because the market is so fragmented. That will fade. It will not fade to zero. It will not go to zero. There will always be a need for that sort of thing. If you look in the securities markets, you see it. But there, as this market is growing, you have a really interesting analog to attract people. So if you ask yourself the question, is Bitcoin going to go up or down? And someone says, well, you know what? It's going to move around a lot. But if you look at the volatility of Bitcoin, sure, it moves around a lot. And I'm looking at my screen right now, and I could share it, and you guys could see all those squiggles, what's going on. The reality is you're getting paid to own it. And when you look at the way institutions look at asset classes that are uncorrelated, all of a sudden, now, by the fact that you can loan it out and share in some of the economics that the trading firms have, it starts to make that ecosystem come together. And that is a very important thing in terms of making that ecosystem mature. So it's definitely a very welcome trend, and it's one that will continue and it will mature over time. Sure, the margins may come in, but it still beats zero, no matter how you want to slice it. And that's a very important thing to know, because one of the big things people have always said about gold is, why do I want to own it? I have to pay to store it instead of getting interest on it. Well, with Bitcoin, that narrative's been flipped because it doesn't cost to store. I mean, yes, you have to pay custodians, but or you have to buy a device or a hardware wallet, but it's cheap. But now you can actually get paid interest on it, and that really flips the script in terms of it being an asset. So I think that's a really important point. So I'm really glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I think you articulated the lending part far better than I did just then. But I think one thing that we'll also have to consider as well is that for the longest time, companies like, for example, Google has taken a very large share of the money that's moving around that we make through our own personal data. And so at the moment, if we look at something like basic attention token on Brave browser, historically, all that money that's paid to the advertiser is going directly to Google. Now, a share of that money is now actually coming to me and everybody else. So now we do have this store of money where we're working and we're being paid for that work. We then have that store of value, and we can then use that store of value to potentially lend out. So, and it's quite a significant fraction. And the more that the markets shift, the more somebody else will come in with another browser and say, okay, 70% isn't enough, I want 90%, and we'll start taking a significant chunk out of this market.
So, yeah, I'm going to guess that. Oh, sorry, I was going to say, Adele, I'm going to guess that you have a pretty interesting opinion about personal data and its value. So I was going to tee you up for that.
Yeah. So that's important for me from the healthcare point of view, because I live in Nashville. I have been in healthcare for 20 plus years there, and there is a lot of debate around like personal data, how you monetize it, who owns it. And although fundamentally everybody agrees that the patient owns the data, what's happening in actuality is that everybody else owns the data except for the patient. So and it's similar to the banking industry. In healthcare, it's tough to get consensus from different stakeholders because there is no incentive to change. There's very small incentive going through. And I want to take that full circle and bring it into the lending industry, because that's one of the things that I'm actively working on, shameless plug. And the biggest thing that you look at it is the whole claim to fame from a banking industry is we take your money and we lend it to other people, and we give you fraction of that for keeping it A, safe, and B, for investing it because we are custodial of your money. So the keeping it safe point is becoming mute. Nobody is kind of like, there is not a lot of armed robberies right now. You're not afraid of somebody attacking you and physically getting the money from you. And if you know your private keys, then nobody can actually take that away from you. So that leaves the investment portion of it, which why you are seeing all of those DAOs come into play, all of the networks that allow you to do different investment rates back, because they are getting in that game of taking the money, investing it, and instead of like keeping it all, they are sharing a lot with the stakeholders there. In Dodd-Frank regulation, they came up with basically the capitalization required. And last time I heard the news around like, hey, we shored up our capitalization from 7% to 8%. That means from a banking point of view, we need to have 8% of the deposited money in the bank. What happened to the 92% left? They lent it out. So all of that is like over and over lent out there, and you don't get any of that benefit. And right now you're getting zero out of that, or maybe even negative. So why should the people pay for the mistakes of the current archaic system? It should be the other way around, because it's the people that are borrowing the money and the people that are lending the money. So naturally, a DAO allows you to manage all of that stuff much more efficient. And that's the existential threat that the banks are facing, either evolve or not. So I talked about the cracks in the system right now. That's why you see PayPal investing into this and starting to say like, okay, our 300 million people will be able of using all of that and buying Bitcoin and Ethereum on our network. You see things like Consensus and AMD investing into also similar technologies. So even JP Morgan and others started to kind of like warm up to those technologies. Like, okay, we might not like Bitcoin per se, but only Bitcoin, but everything else is good. And we like all of that stuff. Why? Because they know the only way to evolve is to get with the technology. It's kind of like back in the 90s when people were saying, actually in the Wall Street, the internet fad. Don't care about it. It's just a fad. It will go away. Nobody will sell stuff about it. You have to be in the store. You have to have customer service. You have to have all of the stuff. Guess what? It's gone. And with a pandemic where you cannot even leave your house, this will become more and more. Some African countries with the government have started shifting to blockchain-based technologies because they can't handle the money. The money is too dirty, literally and figuratively. for the people to exchange it right now. So that's where the value is changing there.
Yeah, we've also got, sorry, go ahead, David.
No, I was going to say there's a lot there to unpack. Why don't you go?
Yeah, I was also just going to add to that one other thing that we hadn't added to the mix, and that is that with all the turmoil and everything going on in the world right now, there's also a huge push for countries, people like in Venezuela, putting their money into crypto and selling all their goods and assets, everything, and crossing the border with nothing. From a safety point of view, and I think there's a huge adoption there happening as well. In fact, that could, if the world descends into a little bit more chaos, we might see a little bit more adoption from people on that side of the world as well.
You didn't just ask for the world to be in more chaos, did you?
I certainly didn't, but I don't see it correcting itself in the most positive way in the very near future. So,
no, and I think, but that point is actually very interesting, because there's so many countries out there. When you're sitting in America, you don't realize how many countries people literally have no faith in their governments, in the currency. It's not just Venezuela. It's not just, you know, what's gone on. It's amusing why the Brazilian currency is called the real. You know, real. Well, it's because the fake currency was the one before that, and the one before that, and the one before that. You know, in Turkey, the lira, you know, they live with double-digit, not just double-digit, but close to triple-digit inflation rates. You know, we've all heard about ones in Africa, etc. It's a big deal. If the euro fell apart, God knows what would happen to some of the southern European countries, right? So it is a non-trivial thing to say that people can't trust the money of their country, and that is a large deal. And when, you know, we're going to hit double-digit trillions of dollars being printed out of thin air between the U.S. and the ECB this year, I mean, you know, one has to think that there's a big issue, but that's a topic that could easily span another full panel, and I'm pretty sure we're almost out of time.
That's
so
fun.
you know,
We're in the fun.
So there you go. So any final thoughts, you know, Gary, to share?
No, I think we're a ways off before the banks start to pay attention. We're in that same situation. I always think back to like the mid-90s with MP3s, and the industry did everything they could to try and stop it. Napster came along, all the illegal industries, all the people demanded it, and at a point that people won over. And now we have companies like Spotify and all that kind of stuff. I see the crypto industry doing a mirror of that same industry.
Yeah, I agree. Adele?
I would say we have a lot of work in front of us. So the sooner we can get systems and applications that solves real world problems and show the masses how they can use the technology in there, the more will be mainstream, and then it will be unstoppable at that point in time. So we need to work really, really hard, work together, establish the community even further, and push, and something really, really great will happen.
Yeah, and for my part, I agree. I mean, I feel like at some point, I feel like I've seen this movie before. I've lived it before. I mean, I've lived through the electronification of securities markets, and where we are in the way crypto trades is very much where the securities markets were, you know, in the end of the 90s, you know, probably around the turn of the century, turn of the millennium. You know, we'll get there. I mean, things like, you know, free retail trading, or retail trading being cheaper. Right now in crypto, it's more expensive for retail than for institutions. And firms like us that focus on best execution, you know, last year, our biggest challenge was for people to even think that best execution mattered, when really what you're talking about is buying as cheaply as possible or selling at the highest price. Obviously that matters because that's what you care about, but that was a hard thing. That's changing. And so as that changes, then the industry evolves. As the industry evolves, it becomes easier for people like Paul Tudor Jones and others to say, you know, people should pay attention to this, because it is a very intelligent and potentially the best way to play the dollar being devalued by all this money being printed, etc. So yeah, I think that it is inevitable. It will take time, but I agree with you. I think we all have, there's a lot of work to be done.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for this. Thanks, David, for leading the panel here. A lot of great information. If anybody has questions, please reach out to them via chat to get more of their information, or if you guys could put your information in chat as to where people can follow you, that'd be great.
Okie doke.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.